He had ended men's ambitions with a single word before, but that night the most powerful man in Chicago would hesitate because of a woman everyone else considered invisible. Naomi Carter lay motionless on the cold marble floor of the Romano estate kitchen, her dark curls spread across the polished stone like ink spilled across a page that no one had meant to read. The mansion around her was impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that only existed inside homes built for power, where every hallway stretched longer than most city apartments and every window looked out across acres of manicured lawns guarded by iron gates and cameras that never slept. Outside, black SUVs waited beneath tall oak trees, engines humming softly in the cool Chicago night, their drivers checking watches and radios as they prepared for what was supposed to be the final move in a conflict that had consumed the city for nearly a year. Inside the mansion, men in tailored suits gathered in the private war room at the far end of the house, their voices low, their expressions sharp with anticipation. They were waiting for one thing only, the decision of Adrian Romano. Adrian Romano stood at the head of a long walnut table beneath a chandelier that glowed like quiet fire above his shoulders. At 37 years old, he carried himself with the calm certainty of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. 6 feet 2 inches tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him like armor, he looked less like a crime boss and more like the kind of executive who closed billion-dollar deals before breakfast. But every man in the room knew the truth. Adrian Romano didn't simply run businesses. He controlled territories, alliances, loyalties, and consequences. And tonight, the war that had divided Chicago's underworld was supposed to end. Maps lay across the table, phones glowed with encrypted messages, and one of Adrian's captains leaned forward, tapping a finger against the glass surface. "We're ready, boss," he said quietly. "Everyone's in position." Adrian didn't answer right away. His dark eyes moved slowly across the room, studying each man with the same careful attention he gave every decision that could change the balance of power in the city. In another part of the mansion, Naomi Carter had been doing exactly what she had done every evening. Since arriving 3 months earlier, working quietly, moving through the enormous house like a shadow that polished surfaces and folded linens and wiped fingerprints from glass doors without ever expecting to be noticed. Naomi was 26 years old, 5'6", with warm brown eyes and a voice so gentle that even the security guards sometimes had to lean closer to hear her say good evening. She had come to the Romano estate through a staffing agency that specialized in placing domestic workers in homes where discretion mattered more than anything else. She had signed the same agreement every employee signed: no questions, no curiosity, no conversations about the things she might overhear. Naomi had followed that rule perfectly. She cleaned the library while meetings happened behind closed doors. She carried trays through hallways where men spoke in careful half-sentences. She lowered her eyes and moved along. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant the job lasted. But tonight something had changed. From the kitchen doorway earlier that evening she had heard fragments of conversation drifting down the corridor, short sentences, urgent voices, the unmistakable tone of men preparing for something serious. Words like midnight, shipment routes, and final strike floated through the air just long enough to make her heart beat faster. Naomi Carter knew very well what happened when powerful men decided a conflict had to end quickly. She had grown up on the south side of Chicago where sirens were as common as traffic lights, where children learned early that decisions made in quiet rooms could echo through entire neighborhoods. She had promised herself long ago that she would build a different kind of life, one defined by patience and kindness and work that kept her far away from trouble. And yet here she was, standing inside the mansion of the most feared man in the city, holding a folded sheet of paper in her hand that she had written only minutes earlier. The words on that paper were simple. A single sentence written slowly in careful handwriting. A sentence that no one had asked her to write and no one expected her to deliver. She had stood outside the war room door for several seconds before gathering the courage to step closer. But courage sometimes arrives too late or too suddenly. And somewhere between the kitchen hallway and that closed door the world had tilted unexpectedly. Now the paper rested loosely in her hand as she lay on the marble floor beneath the bright kitchen lights, the enormous house stretching quietly around her. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Adrian Romano had just left the war room to clear his thoughts before giving the order that would reshape the city. He stepped into the kitchen doorway and stopped. For the first time that night, the most powerful man in Chicago did not think about strategy, territory, or victory. He looked at the young maid lying on the floor, the folded paper between her fingers, and something inside the room shifted before a single word had been spoken. Adrian Romano did not move at first. For a moment he simply stood in the kitchen doorway, his hand still resting lightly against the dark wooden frame as his eyes adjusted to what he was seeing. Naomi Carter had always been part of the background of the house, a quiet presence that appeared in rooms after everyone else had left them, wiping counters, straightening chairs, restoring order in a place where tension lived like a permanent guest. Adrian had noticed her in the way powerful men notice details without admitting they are paying attention. The steady rhythm of her footsteps in the hallway early in the morning. The way she greeted the night security guard with the same soft good evening every time she passed the front desk. The small, careful movements of someone who understood that houses like this belonged to people whose moods could change the direction of entire lives. Naomi Carter had been working at the Romano estate for exactly 92 days. She had arrived with a single suitcase, 2 neatly folded uniforms, and a recommendation letter from the agency that had placed her. The head housekeeper had explained the rules on her first morning. Speak only when necessary. Never interrupt a meeting. Never ask questions about visitors. Never walk into rooms where the boss and his captains were gathered. Naomi had nodded to every rule with quiet understanding because she had spent most of her life learning how to survive in places where silence was safer than curiosity. Before this job she had worked at a diner on the west side of Chicago, the kind of neighborhood restaurant where truck drivers drank black coffee before sunrise and families shared pancakes on Sundays after church. The pay there had been barely enough to cover rent for the small apartment she shared with an elderly aunt in a narrow brick building 3 miles away. When the employment agency called and offered a position in a private estate that paid 3 times as much, Naomi had accepted the opportunity without hesitation. She did not care about the rumors surrounding the Romano name. She cared about stability, about keeping the lights on at home, about making sure her aunt had the medication she needed each month. And for 3 months she had done exactly what the job required. She cleaned the long hallways lined with oil paintings of Italian landscapes. She polished the stainless steel kitchen appliances until they reflected the ceiling lights like mirrors. She replaced fresh flowers in crystal vases every morning before anyone else came downstairs. Most days she saw Adrian Romano only from a distance as he crossed the grand foyer surrounded by men who walked half a step behind him. Their conversations were quiet and serious, their eyes scanning the rooms automatically as if the entire house were part of a careful calculation. Naomi never lingered in those moments. She stepped aside politely, lowered her gaze, and continued with her work. But there had been small moments when Adrian noticed things others overlooked. Once he had passed through the kitchen late at night and seen Naomi leaving a plate of food on the counter near the back entrance. One of the younger security guards had been standing outside in the cold for hours, and when he stepped inside she simply nodded toward the plate and returned to wiping the counter as if kindness required no explanation. Another evening Adrian had heard quiet humming drifting through the hallway outside his office. The sound was soft, almost like a lullaby carried through the air vents, steady and calm in a house that rarely knew calm at all. He had opened the door just enough to see Naomi polishing the brass railing on the staircase, completely unaware that anyone was listening. Those small observations had stayed with him without explanation. Now, standing in the kitchen doorway, Adrian saw that same woman lying motionless on the polished floor beneath the bright overhead lights. The folded sheet of paper still rested between her fingers as if she had been holding it carefully even after the world around her shifted. Adrian stepped forward slowly, his dress shoes making almost no sound against the marble as he crossed the wide kitchen. He crouched beside her, studying her face with the same quiet concentration he used in business negotiations. Naomi's breathing was shallow but steady, her expression peaceful in a way that made the entire situation feel strangely unreal. She looked less like someone caught in the middle of a dangerous night and more like a person who had simply fallen asleep after a long day of work. Adrian reached down and gently lifted the paper from her hand. The sheet was slightly crumpled, the handwriting careful and deliberate as if each letter had been chosen with thought rather than haste. Before he unfolded it, he glanced once more at Naomi Carter, the maid who had spent 3 months moving silently through his home. In the war room down the hall, his captains were still waiting for his decision. But for the first time that night, Adrian Romano had forgotten about the men waiting for orders and the city waiting for the outcome of a conflict that had lasted far too long. Adrian Romano unfolded the paper slowly, the faint rustle of it echoing through the enormous kitchen as if the house itself were listening. The handwriting was careful, slightly uneven, the kind of writing someone produced when the words mattered more than the speed of writing them. For a long second he simply looked at the sentence without speaking, and the quiet confidence that usually defined his presence seemed to pause with him. The message was short, written in dark ink that had pressed deeply into the page. Please stop the war. Too many children will lose their fathers tonight. Adrian Romano had read thousands of documents in his life. Contracts, reports, financial statements, coded messages from allies and rivals. None of them had ever been written in a voice like this. There was no accusation in the words, no fear either, only a quiet plea that carried the weight of someone who believed it might actually matter. Adrian glanced back down at Naomi Carter. Her face was calm, her breathing steady, and for the first time he noticed that she was still holding the edge of her apron as if she had been clutching it when she fell. The kitchen lights reflected softly across the polished marble floor, and the scent of freshly cleaned citrus from the countertops lingered in the air. Nothing about the room suggested urgency except the folded message in his hand and the distant echo of voices down the hallway where his captains were still waiting. Adrian's mind moved the way it always did when he was confronted with something unexpected. He replayed the last hour of the evening piece by piece, examining each moment like a photograph. Earlier that night he had stood in the war room listening as his advisors outlined the final phase of a conflict that had divided the city's underworld into 2 sides. The Romano organization controlled the north side of Chicago, a network of businesses and alliances that stretched from Lake Shore Drive to the suburbs beyond O'Hare Airport. The rival group, led by a man named Victor Bianchi, had been pushing against those borders for months. What had started as small disagreements over territory had slowly expanded into something larger, something that drew attention from people who preferred stability over chaos. Adrian had managed conflicts before. Negotiation was always his first tool. But there came moments when negotiations ended and decisions had to be made with clarity. Tonight had been scheduled as that moment. Every detail had been planned carefully. Vehicles were already positioned throughout the city. Communications channels were secure. Adrian's captains were prepared to move within minutes once he confirmed the order. For them the evening was simple. They were waiting for their leader to finish the sentence that would set the entire plan in motion. Yet here he was in the kitchen holding a single sheet of paper written by a woman whose name had never once appeared in any of those plans. Naomi Carter. A maid who cleaned floors and polished silverware and greeted the night guards with the same quiet kindness every evening. Adrian looked again at the message and then at Naomi. A strange thought crossed his mind, one he had not expected. It had taken courage for her to write this. Not the loud kind of courage that men displayed in front of each other when they wanted to prove something. This was a quieter kind, the kind that appeared when someone believed their voice might disappear if they did not use it. Naomi had not been part of any meeting tonight. She had not been invited to offer an opinion about matters that powerful men believed only they could understand. And yet she had listened, thought about what those decisions might mean beyond the walls of this mansion, and written a single sentence that carried the weight of everything she feared might happen. Adrian realized that she must have tried to deliver the message herself. The paper had been folded as if it had been meant for someone to read directly, not left on a counter or slipped under a door. That meant Naomi Carter had walked toward a room filled with men who rarely welcomed interruptions. The image settled quietly in his mind. A young woman standing outside the war room door, holding a piece of paper with a message she knew could change the direction of an entire night. Adrian exhaled slowly and stood up, the paper still in his hand. Down the hallway the sound of chairs shifting suggested that the men in the war room were growing impatient. One of his captains called his name from the doorway at the far end of the corridor. Adrian turned slightly toward the voice but did not answer right away. Instead he looked once more at Naomi Carter lying on the marble floor and then at the sentence written across the page. For years people had believed that Adrian Romano controlled every important decision in the city. But in that quiet kitchen he understood something unexpected. Tonight the most powerful decision of all had arrived in the handwriting of someone the world had never thought to listen to. Adrian Romano folded the paper carefully and held it between his fingers as he stepped away from Naomi Carter and toward the hallway. The mansion that usually felt enormous and controlled now seemed strangely still, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what he would do next. From the far end of the corridor the voices of his captains drifted toward him, low and impatient. The war room doors were open now, and the long table inside glowed beneath the soft light of another chandelier. Maps of Chicago were spread across the polished surface, each district marked with colored pins and notes that had taken weeks to prepare. For the men standing around that table, everything was simple. They had waited months for this moment, for the final confirmation that would allow them to finish a conflict that had dragged on far longer than anyone wanted. One of the captains stepped forward when Adrian appeared in the doorway. His name was Marco Salazar, a man who had been part of Adrian's inner circle for more than 10 years. Marco studied Adrian's face carefully, the way experienced men do when they are trying to read a decision before it is spoken. "Boss," Marco said quietly, "everyone is ready. All units are in place." Adrian did not immediately answer. Instead he walked slowly toward the center of the table and looked down at the map that showed the city he had spent most of his life learning to understand. Chicago at night was a web of quiet streets, glowing office towers, and neighborhoods where ordinary families were finishing dinner, watching television, or putting their children to bed without any idea how close they sometimes came to decisions made in rooms like this one. The colored markers on the map represented businesses, warehouses, and intersections where his people were stationed. Every pin had a purpose. Every plan had been reviewed and refined until it worked perfectly on paper. But the folded sheet of paper in Adrian's hand felt heavier than all of it. Marco noticed the paper and frowned slightly. "What is that?" he asked. Adrian looked at it for a moment before answering. "A message," he said calmly. Another captain at the far end of the table shifted his weight. "From who?" Adrian did not look up when he replied. "From someone who does not usually speak in rooms like this." The men exchanged brief glances. In their world, information usually came from informants, advisors, or partners who understood the rules of power. A message from outside that circle was unusual. Marco leaned forward slightly, his voice careful but firm. "Adrian, the situation tonight cannot wait. If we do not move now, Bianchi will think we hesitated." Adrian finally lifted his eyes from the map. His gaze moved slowly across the faces of the men around him, men who trusted his judgment because it had guided them through years of difficult decisions. They expected certainty from him. They expected the calm authority that had built his reputation across the city. Adrian placed the folded paper on the table. The small piece of white rested against the dark wood like something fragile in a room built for strategy. "Before we continue," he said quietly, "I want you to understand something." The room grew silent. Adrian Romano was not a man who paused before giving orders. When he did, everyone listened. "There is someone in the kitchen," he continued. "One of the staff. Naomi Carter." A few of the captains looked confused. The name meant nothing to them. Adrian noticed their expressions. "She works here. Cleans the house. Keeps the place running while we focus on everything else." Marco nodded slowly, still unsure why that mattered. "What happened to her?" Adrian rested one hand on the edge of the table. "She tried to bring me this message." He unfolded the paper and turned it so everyone could see the single sentence written across the page. For a moment no one spoke. The words were simple enough for anyone to understand. "Please stop the war. Too many children will lose their fathers tonight. One of the younger captains gave a short, uncertain laugh. Boss, with respect, she does not understand what this is about. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead he watched the men around him read the sentence again. Marco finally spoke, more quietly this time. Adrian, a maid wrote that? Adrian nodded once. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different from the confident anticipation that had filled the space earlier. Now there was uncertainty in the air, the feeling that the evening had shifted in a way none of them expected. Adrian folded the paper again and picked it up from the table. His voice remained calm when he spoke next, but something about the tone made every man in the room straighten slightly. For months we have planned how to end this conflict, he said. We studied numbers, territory, influence. We considered strategy. He looked down at the message once more. But tonight someone outside this room reminded me that our decisions do not stop here. Marco studied Adrian carefully, beginning to understand that something important had changed. In the quiet war room inside the Romano mansion, the men who had been waiting for a command realized that the most powerful voice in the building had come from someone they had never expected to hear at all. The silence inside the war room stretched longer than anyone expected, the kind of silence that forced every man present to reconsider what they thought they understood about the night. Adrian Romano stood at the head of the table with the folded sheet of paper resting between his fingers, and for the first time since the meeting had begun the maps, the plans, and the strategies spread across the polished wood no longer seemed like the most important things in the room. Marco Salazar watched his boss carefully, his instincts telling him that Adrian was not hesitating out of uncertainty but because he was weighing something deeper than strategy. Marco had followed Adrian Romano long enough to recognize that look. It was the same expression Adrian wore whenever he faced a decision that would define more than territory or reputation. One of the younger captains cleared his throat quietly, shifting the tension that had settled across the room. Adrian, he said carefully, we respect what you are saying. But Bianchi will not stop because someone asked politely. A few of the men nodded in agreement. For months the conflict had grown steadily, spreading through business deals, territory disputes, and alliances that forced people to choose sides whether they wanted to or not. No one in this room believed Victor Bianchi would simply walk away because someone asked for peace. Adrian listened without interrupting. His expression remained calm, but his eyes moved slowly across the faces of the men who had trusted him to lead them through every difficult moment of the past decade. He understood their concern. Loyalty in their world was built on strength and certainty, and strength often meant proving that hesitation had no place in leadership. Adrian placed the folded note back on the table and rested both hands against the polished surface as he looked down at the map of Chicago one more time. Every colored marker represented a place where someone tonight was waiting for instructions. Some of those men were standing beside vehicles with their phones ready. Others were watching quiet warehouses or offices across the city. They had prepared themselves to move when the signal arrived. Adrian imagined what those streets looked like at that exact moment. Ordinary traffic lights changing colors. Families finishing dinner. A few late commuters stepping out of trains and walking toward apartment buildings where the lights were still warm behind the windows. Chicago was a city of millions of people, most of whom would never know the names of the men sitting around this table. Yet decisions made here could ripple through neighborhoods that had nothing to do with rivalries or territory. Adrian straightened slowly and looked at Marco. Do you remember the first time we worked together? He asked quietly. Marco blinked, surprised by the question. Of course, he replied. South Side Warehouse. 15 years ago. Adrian nodded once. You told me something that night. Marco frowned slightly as he tried to remember. Adrian spoke before he could answer. You said that power means knowing when to move forward and when to stop. Marco leaned back a little, recognizing the memory now. That was a long time ago, he said. Adrian allowed a faint smile to touch the corner of his mouth. It was good advice. The room remained silent as the meaning of his words began to settle in. Adrian picked up the folded paper again and held it carefully, almost thoughtfully, as if the message written there carried more weight than anyone expected. Naomi Carter did not know anything about our plans, Adrian continued. She does not understand the details of this conflict. She does not know Victor Bianchi or the people who stand behind him. One of the captains nodded. Exactly. That is why we cannot base our decision on what she wrote. Adrian shook his head slightly. No, he said calmly. That is exactly why we should listen. The men around the table exchanged uncertain looks. Adrian's voice remained steady as he continued. For months we have been thinking like men who know the rules of this world. Strategy, territory, reputation. We assumed those were the only things that mattered. He paused for a moment and glanced again at the sentence written on the paper. But Naomi Carter looked at the same situation from a place none of us considered. She did not think about power. She thought about the people who would feel the consequences of our decisions. Marco studied Adrian closely now, his expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. He knew Adrian well enough to recognize when a decision had already formed in his mind. The younger captains, however, were still struggling to understand where the conversation was heading. One of them leaned forward slightly. Boss, are you saying we should cancel everything because of this? Adrian did not raise his voice when he answered, but the calm certainty in his tone made every man in the room straighten. I am saying, Adrian replied, that's sometimes the clearest. Truth comes from the person who has the least reason to speak. He looked around the table one last time, meeting each pair of eyes directly. The men who had come expecting an order to move now realized they were about to hear something entirely different. And somewhere down the hallway, in the quiet kitchen where the light still reflected across the marble floor, Naomi Carter remained unaware that the single sentence she had written had begun to change the direction of the entire night. Adrian Romano remained standing at the head of the table while the room held its breath around him. The men who had spent months preparing for this moment now watched their leader with a mixture of uncertainty and loyalty, waiting to see whether the calm certainty that had always defined his decisions would return. Adrian slowly folded the sheet of paper once more and placed it carefully into the inside pocket of his suit jacket as if the message belonged somewhere close to his heart. Then he looked up at the men gathered before him. Call everyone, he said quietly. For a second no one moved because the instruction was not specific enough for a room that usually operated on precise commands. Marco Salazar was the first to react. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone but paused before dialing. Adrian, he said carefully, call them for what? Adrian met his gaze without hesitation. Tell them to stand down. The words were spoken in the same calm voice he used for every instruction, yet the effect inside the room was immediate. Several of the captains exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. One of the younger men leaned forward across the table as if he had misheard. Stand down, he repeated. Adrian did not raise his voice. Yes, he said. All units return to base. Tonight ends differently. Marco studied Adrian for another long moment before finally nodding. In the years he had worked beside Adrian Romano he had learned that when the boss reached this level of certainty there was no reason to argue further. Marco began dialing the first number, his voice steady as he spoke instructions into the phone. Across the table the other captains slowly followed his lead, reaching for their own phones and radios. One by one the messages spread outward through the network of men waiting across Chicago. Engines that had been idling outside warehouses were switched off. Drivers who had been checking their watches leaned back into their seats with quiet relief. Phones buzzed across the city with the same unexpected order. Stand down. Return to base. The war room inside the Romano mansion remained silent except for the low murmur of men relaying instructions. Adrian watched the process unfold without speaking. For months every plan had pointed toward this night. The maps, the discussions, the preparations had all been leading to a single moment when he would give the signal to move forward. Now the signal moving through the city carried a different meaning entirely. After several minutes Marco ended his final call and looked up from his phone. It is done, he said quietly. Adrian nodded once. Good. The younger captains still seemed unsettled, their eyes moving between Adrian and the map spread across the table. One of them finally spoke again. What happens now? Adrian stepped away from the table and walked slowly toward the doorway. Now, he replied, we take care of the person who reminded us why the decision mattered. The men followed his gaze down the hallway toward the kitchen where the lights were still shining. Marco was the first to understand. The maid, he said softly. Adrian nodded. Naomi Carter. Without another word, Adrian began walking down the corridor. His footsteps echoed quietly against the polished hardwood floor as the captains followed behind him. The long hallway that connected the war room to the rest of the mansion suddenly felt different, as if the tension that had filled the house earlier had been replaced by something quieter and more reflective. When Adrian reached the kitchen doorway, he slowed his pace. Naomi Carter was still lying where he had found her, the marble floor reflecting the overhead lights around her like calm water. Her breathing remained steady, and the folded edge of her apron was still clutched lightly in one hand. Adrian stepped inside and knelt beside her again, the same man who had commanded an entire network across the city now lowering himself without hesitation beside someone the world rarely noticed. Marco and the other captains stopped a few feet behind him, watching in silence as Adrian gently checked Naomi's pulse with the careful attention of someone who understood that power sometimes meant protecting rather than commanding. Adrian glanced up at Marco. Call a doctor, he said. Marco nodded immediately and stepped back into the hallway to make the call. The rest of the men remained quiet, their expressions thoughtful as they watched the scene unfold. In the enormous Romano kitchen, beneath bright lights and high ceilings built for a life of influence, the most feared man in Chicago knelt beside a young maid whose voice had carried farther than any of them had expected. The kitchen remained quiet except for the faint hum of the large refrigerator units and the distant murmur of Marco Salazar speaking on the phone in the hallway. Adrian Romano stayed kneeling beside Naomi Carter, his posture steady and deliberate as if the marble floor beneath him were the most natural place in the world for the man who usually commanded entire rooms simply by entering them. The other captains stood several feet away, unsure whether to move closer or remain where they were. In their experience, Adrian rarely allowed anyone to witness moments that were not part of a larger strategy, yet tonight he had not asked them to leave. Naomi's breathing was slow but even, and Adrian kept his attention on the small rise and fall of her shoulders as he waited. The house that had felt charged with tension earlier now seemed strangely calm, as if the decision made in the war room had quietly drained the pressure from the entire building. Marco returned from the hallway after finishing his call. The doctor is on the way, he said, lowering his phone. He said he will be here in 15 minutes. Adrian nodded without looking up. Good. Marco glanced down at Naomi, then back at Adrian. She will be all right? Adrian placed 2 fingers gently against Naomi's wrist again, confirming what he had already felt before. Her pulse is steady, he said calmly. She will wake up. The younger captains exchanged brief looks. One of them shifted his weight and spoke quietly. Boss, should we move her to one of the guest rooms? Adrian considered the suggestion but shook his head slightly. Not yet, he replied. Let her rest here until the doctor arrives. The men accepted the answer without further discussion. They had begun to realize that the quiet authority guiding Adrian's decisions tonight came from somewhere deeper than the calculations that normally shaped their plans. Adrian glanced around the kitchen slowly, taking in details he rarely noticed during his busy days. The wide marble island in the center of the room gleamed beneath soft lights. A bowl of fresh lemon sat near the sink where Naomi must have been cleaning earlier. The faint scent of citrus and soap lingered in the air, a reminder that while the men in the war room had been discussing strategy, someone else had been working quietly to keep the house running smoothly. Adrian's gaze returned to Naomi's face. He tried to imagine what her evening must have been like before she collapsed here on the floor. She must have overheard the conversation about the plan. She must have realized what the night meant. And instead of ignoring it or pretending not to understand, She had taken the time to write that message and walk toward a room filled with men who rarely welcomed interruptions. Adrian felt a faint shift in his chest as he thought about that moment. It was not something he could easily describe. It was simply the recognition that courage sometimes appeared in the quietest forms. Marco leaned lightly against the counter nearby, watching Adrian with thoughtful curiosity. After several minutes he spoke again. "You know," Marco said slowly, "none of us expected the night to end like this." Adrian gave a small nod. "Neither did I." Marco folded his arms across his chest. "But I think she understood something we forgot." Adrian looked up at him. "What is that?" Marco gestured toward Naomi. "That power does not always belong to the people in the room making plans." Adrian allowed a faint smile to appear. "That is exactly right." The younger captains remained quiet, listening carefully to the exchange. For years they had believed strength meant control, influence, and the ability to command loyalty. Tonight they were witnessing another version of strength entirely. One that appeared in the form of a young woman who had simply asked someone powerful to stop and think. Minutes passed slowly. The large clock mounted on the far wall ticked softly, each second moving the night forward in a way that felt calmer than before. Outside the mansion, the SUVs that had been waiting beneath the oak trees were beginning to pull away one by one as the drivers received their orders to return home. The city beyond the gates continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that the course of the evening had already changed. Adrian remained beside Naomi the entire time. He did not stand or return to the war room. The most feared man in Chicago stayed exactly where he was, kneeling beside the maid who had reminded him that decisions made in quiet rooms could echo far beyond the walls of power. The steady rhythm of the clock on the kitchen wall continued to mark the passing minutes, each soft tick echoing through the quiet room as Adrian Romano remained beside Naomi Carter. The mansion, once filled with the low intensity of men preparing for conflict, now felt almost peaceful. The captains who had followed Adrian into the kitchen stood near the counters or leaned lightly against the walls, their conversations reduced to occasional whispers. None of them seemed eager to return to the war room where maps and plans still covered the table. For the first time in many months, the night felt uncertain in a way that did not revolve around strategy. Adrian watched Naomi carefully. Her breathing remained calm, and a faint movement passed across her fingers as if she were slowly drifting back toward awareness. The folded edge of her apron shifted slightly against the polished marble floor. Adrian leaned a little closer, his voice low but steady when he spoke. "Naomi," he said quietly. "You are safe. Take your time." The men behind him exchanged brief glances. They had never heard Adrian Romano speak with that particular tone before. It was not the controlled authority he used during negotiations or the confident calm that guided his decisions. It sounded more patient, almost protective. Marco Salazar noticed the change as well. He watched Adrian for a moment before stepping closer to the kitchen island, resting one hand against the smooth surface. "The doctor should arrive any minute," he said softly, almost as if he did not want to disturb the stillness that had settled over the room. Adrian nodded once but did not move away from Naomi. Outside the large windows the dark Chicago night stretched quietly across the lawns surrounding the mansion. The oak tree swayed gently in the breeze, and the long driveway that had been lined with vehicles earlier was now empty again. Far beyond the gates the city continued its ordinary rhythm. Neon lights glowed above corner diners, trains rumbled across elevated tracks, and thousands of people moved through their evenings unaware that a decision made inside this kitchen had quietly prevented something far larger from unfolding. Naomi's eyelids fluttered slightly. The movement was small, but Adrian noticed it immediately. He leaned closer, his voice calm and reassuring. "Naomi," he said again. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened slowly, the bright kitchen lights causing her to blink as she tried to focus. For a moment confusion passed across her expression. The last thing she remembered was walking down the hallway with the folded paper in her hand, gathering the courage to step toward the war room door. Now the ceiling above her looked unfamiliar from this angle, And the first face she saw leaning over her was the one person she had least expected to see so close. Adrian Romano. Naomi's eyes widened slightly as recognition settled in. She tried to sit up instinctively, but Adrian gently placed a hand near her shoulder to stop her from moving too quickly. "Easy," he said quietly. "You fainted. Just stay still for a moment." Naomi looked around the room slowly, noticing the captain standing nearby and the open hallway behind them. Her voice came out soft and uncertain. "I am sorry," she said automatically. "I did not mean to cause trouble." Adrian studied her expression carefully. Even after waking up on the marble floor in front of the most powerful men in the city, her first instinct had been to apologize. "You did not cause trouble," Adrian replied. Naomi blinked again, still trying to understand what had happened. Then her memory returned in a sudden rush. Her hand moved quickly toward the pocket of her apron before she remembered that the paper had been taken from her earlier. "The note," she said quietly, her eyes lifting toward Adrian with a mixture of worry and determination. "Did you read it?" Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded the sheet of paper once more. He held it carefully where she could see the words written across the page. Naomi nodded slightly when she recognized her own handwriting. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Adrian looked directly into her eyes and answered the question she had been afraid to ask. "Yes," he said calmly. "I read it." Naomi searched his expression, uncertain what his response would be. The room remained silent behind them as every man present waited to hear what Adrian Romano would say next. Adrian folded the paper again and slipped it back into his pocket before speaking in the same calm voice he had used all night. "And I listened." Naomi Carter stared at Adrian Romano for several seconds as his words settled slowly in her mind. "I listened." The sentence echoed in the quiet kitchen with a weight she had never expected her small note to carry. For a moment she did not know what to say. Her eyes moved past Adrian and toward the men standing nearby, the captains who had filled the war room earlier that night. Their presence reminded her exactly where she was and who she had interrupted. Naomi pushed one hand gently against the cool marble floor and tried to sit up again, more carefully this time. Adrian allowed the movement but remained close enough to steady her if she lost balance. She leaned slightly against the base of the kitchen island, her breathing still a little slow as she gathered her thoughts. "I am sorry if I overstepped," she said quietly. "I know it is not my place to speak about things like that." Adrian studied her expression before answering. "Why did you write it?" he asked. Naomi hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure whether she should explain herself. The captains remained silent behind him, listening with the same attention they normally reserved for strategic briefings. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly before speaking again. "Because I heard part of the conversation earlier," she said softly. "Not everything. Just enough to understand that something important was going to happen tonight." She glanced toward the hallway that led to the war room. "I have lived in Chicago my whole life. I know what happens when powerful people decide they have reached the end of an argument." Adrian listened without interrupting. Naomi continued slowly, choosing each word carefully as if she still felt like a guest in a room where her voice did not belong. "When I was younger, my neighborhood changed because of decisions like that. Not just one time. Many times. People who had nothing to do with those disagreements still felt the consequences." Her voice remained calm, but there was quiet conviction behind it. "I do not know anything about your business. I did not pretend to understand it. But I know what families look like when they are worried about the people they love coming home safely." The room stayed completely silent as she spoke. Adrian noticed that none of the captains interrupted her or showed the skepticism they might have earlier. Something about the honesty in Naomi's voice held their attention. Naomi took a small breath before finishing. "So I wrote the note because I thought that maybe if someone powerful read it before everything started, they might pause long enough to remember the people who would never be in that room." Adrian Romano remained still for several seconds after she finished speaking. The kitchen lights reflected softly across the marble floor between them, and the folded message rested quietly inside his jacket pocket. Finally Adrian nodded once. "You were right about one thing," he said calmly. Naomi looked up, uncertain what he meant. Adrian continued in the same steady tone. "I did pause." Naomi searched his face, trying to understand whether that pause had changed anything. "Did it matter?" she asked softly. Adrian held her gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he said. Naomi waited, but Adrian did not explain further immediately. Instead he glanced briefly toward Marco Salazar, who was standing near the doorway with the other captains. Marco understood the silent cue and spoke first. "All operations were cancelled," he said plainly. Naomi blinked in surprise. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood him. "Cancelled?" Marco nodded. "Every vehicle went home. Every plan stopped." Naomi's eyes widened slightly as she looked back at Adrian. "Because of the note?" Adrian shook his head gently. "Because it reminded me of something important." Naomi waited, but Adrian did not elaborate immediately. Instead he leaned back slightly from where he had been kneeling and rested one hand on the edge of the counter beside her. His voice remained calm when he finally spoke again. "For months I have been making decisions based on strategy and influence," he said. "But tonight someone reminded me that power should also consider the people who are never invited into those conversations." Naomi looked down at her hands for a moment, clearly overwhelmed by the realization that her simple message had changed something far larger than she had imagined. "I did not expect anyone to listen," she said quietly. Adrian gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "That is exactly why I did." At that moment, the sound of a car approaching along the driveway drifted through the open hallway. Marco glanced toward the front of the house. "That will be the doctor," he said. Adrian nodded but kept his attention on Naomi Carter, the young maid who had walked toward a closed door earlier that night with nothing but a folded piece of paper and the courage to ask someone powerful to stop and think. The sound of tires rolling slowly across the long gravel driveway reached the kitchen a few seconds later, followed by the distant closing of a car door somewhere near the front entrance of the mansion. The quiet house carried every small sound clearly now that the tension from earlier had disappeared. Marco Salazar glanced toward the hallway and gave a short nod to one of the younger captains, who immediately stepped away to guide the arriving doctor through the front of the estate. Naomi Carter remained seated against the kitchen island, still trying to fully understand the chain of events that had unfolded around her. The bright lights above the marble counters made everything feel strangely vivid, as if the entire night had slowed down long enough for her to catch up with it. Adrian Romano stayed nearby, leaning lightly against the counter beside her with the relaxed posture of someone who had already made the most important decision of the evening. Naomi looked at him carefully for a moment, her voice still quiet but steadier now. "I did not think someone like you would change plans because of a note from someone like me," she said honestly. Adrian met her gaze without hesitation. "People assume that power means ignoring voices that come from unexpected places," he replied calmly. "But the truth is that the strongest leaders learn when to listen." Naomi absorbed his words slowly. For years she had believed that the distance between people like her and people like Adrian Romano was impossible to cross. She had spent her life working quietly in kitchens, diners, and apartment buildings, places where the most important thing she could do was remain respectful and unnoticed. The idea that her voice had reached across that distance still felt unreal. Adrian studied her thoughtful expression for a moment before speaking again. "You said earlier that you grew up in Chicago," he said. Naomi nodded. "South Side," she answered softly. Adrian gave a small nod as if that detail confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then you understand this city better than most people in rooms like ours," he said. Naomi looked slightly confused by the comment. Adrian continued, his voice calm and reflective. "Many of the people who sit at tables like the one in my war room learned about Chicago through numbers and reports. They study maps and business records. But you learned about the city through people." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment, remembering the narrow streets and crowded apartment buildings where she had spent most of her childhood. Yes, she said quietly. Through people. Adrian straightened slightly from where he had been leaning against the counter. That perspective matters, he said. The footsteps of the approaching doctor echoed down the hallway then, growing louder as the man entered the kitchen accompanied by the captain who had gone to meet him. The doctor was a middle-aged man with silver hair and calm, practiced movements that suggested he had spent many years responding to urgent calls in unusual circumstances. He carried a small medical bag and nodded politely to Adrian as he stepped closer. "Good evening, Mr. Romano," he said. Adrian returned the greeting with a brief nod. "Thank you for coming on short notice." The doctor glanced toward Naomi and immediately knelt beside her with the efficiency of someone who had handled similar situations many times before. "Let us take a quick look," he said gently. Naomi allowed him to check her pulse and shine a small light briefly across her eyes while the men in the room stepped back slightly to give them space. After a minute the doctor closed his bag again and stood. "She will be fine," he said calmly. "It appears she fainted from stress and exhaustion. She simply needs rest and water." A faint sense of relief passed through the room. Marco nodded once in appreciation. Naomi let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. Adrian looked down at her again, his voice steady. "You heard him," he said. "You should rest tonight." Naomi nodded, though her thoughts were still catching up with everything that had happened. The doctor gathered his bag and exchanged a few quiet words with Marco before preparing to leave the kitchen. As he stepped away, Adrian looked once more at Naomi Carter, the young woman whose simple message had altered the direction of the night. Around them the mansion felt peaceful again, as if the house itself recognized that something important had quietly shifted inside its walls. The doctor's footsteps faded down the hallway, and once again the kitchen returned to the quiet rhythm that had settled over the mansion since the plans for the night had been called off. Naomi Carter remained seated beside the marble island, a glass of water now resting in her hands after Marco had quietly brought it to her from the sink. She took a slow sip while the cool liquid helped steady her thoughts. Around her, the men who had once filled the war room with strategy now seemed strangely thoughtful, as if the events of the night had shifted something deeper than any single decision. Adrian Romano stood nearby with his hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, his attention still focused on Naomi with the same calm patience he had shown since the moment she woke. For several seconds no one spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was simply the kind of quiet that follows when a room full of people realizes that something important has happened without anyone planning it. Naomi lowered the glass slightly and glanced around the kitchen, noticing that the men who had once looked so intimidating now seemed more reflective than threatening. Her voice was gentle when she finally spoke again. "I hope I did not cause trouble for anyone tonight," she said softly. One of the younger captains shook his head immediately, surprising even himself with how quickly the answer came. "No," he said. "You probably saved us from making a mistake." The other men exchanged small nods, their expressions thoughtful. Marco Salazar leaned his shoulder against the wall near the doorway, folding his arms loosely as he looked at Naomi with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "You know," Marco said slowly, "most people who walk into this house never speak to Adrian unless they absolutely have to. Even then they choose their words carefully." Naomi looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. "I was not trying to be brave," she admitted quietly. "I just thought someone should remember the people outside the room." Adrian listened to the exchange without interrupting. When Marco finished speaking, Adrian stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but clear enough that every man in the kitchen could hear it. "That is exactly why it mattered," he said. Naomi looked up at him again, still unsure how to react to the weight his words seemed to carry. Adrian continued in the same steady tone. "People in positions like mine hear many voices every day. Advisors, partners, competitors. Most of those voices are focused on winning arguments or protecting interests." He paused briefly before finishing the thought. "Very few remind us why those arguments exist in the first place." The men around the room remained silent, absorbing the reflection. Naomi held the glass carefully in both hands, her eyes lowered as if she still felt like she had stepped somewhere she did not belong. Adrian noticed the hesitation and spoke again, this time more gently. "Naomi," he said. She looked up immediately. "Yes, sir?" Adrian gave a small shake of his head. "You do not need to call me sir tonight." The comment caused a faint ripple of surprise among the captains. Adrian rarely corrected formal titles. Naomi blinked slightly, unsure what to say instead. Adrian offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Adrian is fine." Naomi hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. "All right. Adrian." The name sounded unfamiliar in the quiet kitchen, but it carried a strange sense of equality that had not existed there before. Adrian stepped a little closer and gestured toward the hallway leading deeper into the house. "You should get some rest," he said. "There is a guest room on the second floor where you can sleep tonight. Someone will bring you anything you need." Naomi began to stand, moving carefully now that her strength had returned. Marco stepped forward instinctively to help steady her, but she managed to keep her balance. "Thank you," she said sincerely. As she prepared to leave the kitchen, she paused and looked back at Adrian once more. "I did not expect tonight to change anything," she admitted quietly. Adrian met her gaze with the same calm expression he had worn all evening. "Sometimes the smallest voices create the biggest changes," he replied. Naomi nodded thoughtfully before walking slowly toward the hallway, her footsteps soft against the polished floor. The captains watched her disappear from the room in silence. When the hallway finally grew quiet again, Marco looked back toward Adrian Romano with a faint smile. "You know," Marco said, "most people spend years trying to get your attention in this city." Adrian looked toward the doorway where Naomi had just left and answered calmly. "She was not trying to get my attention," he said. "She was trying to get my conscience." The mansion gradually settled into the deep quiet that arrives after midnight, the kind of stillness that only large houses know when the people inside finally stop moving and the long corridors return to silence. Naomi Carter walked slowly up the staircase toward the second-floor guest room that Marco had pointed out to her. Each step felt slightly unreal, as if the evening she had just experienced belonged to someone else entirely. Only a few hours earlier she had been moving through the kitchen the way she always did, wiping counters and stacking dishes, trying not to overhear conversations that were never meant for her ears. Now the same house felt different, not because its marble floors or tall ceilings had changed, but because the distance she once believed existed between her world and Adrian Romano's world had quietly shifted. When she reached the guest room at the end of the hallway, she paused at the door for a moment, listening to the soft hum of the house around her. The room was larger than the small apartment she shared with her aunt, with tall windows overlooking the dark lawns and a neatly made bed waiting beneath warm lamps. Naomi stepped inside slowly and closed the door behind her, sitting at the edge of the bed as the events of the night finally caught up with her. Downstairs in the kitchen, the captains had gradually begun to leave as well. One by one they nodded to Adrian Romano before stepping into the hallway and heading toward the front of the mansion. Their work for the night had ended in a way none of them had expected, and although they did not say it out loud, many of them carried a quiet sense of relief with them as they disappeared through the front doors and into the calm Chicago night. Soon only Adrian and Marco Salazar remained in the kitchen. Marco leaned lightly against the counter while Adrian looked out the wide window toward the empty driveway. For several minutes neither of them spoke. Finally Marco broke the silence. "You know," he said slowly, "most people in this city think they understand you." Adrian glanced at him without turning fully away from the window. "Do they?" Marco nodded. "They think you make decisions based only on power, territory, influence." Adrian considered the comment for a moment before replying. "Sometimes those things matter." Marco gave a small smile. Tonight something else mattered more. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead he reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the small piece of paper once again. The single sentence Naomi had written looked exactly the same as it had when he first read it earlier that night. "Please stop the war." Too many children will lose their fathers tonight. Adrian studied the words quietly. Do you know why it worked? He asked after a moment. Marco raised an eyebrow. Because she was honest? Adrian shook his head slightly. Because she was not asking for herself. Marco nodded thoughtfully as the meaning settled in. In their world, almost every request came from someone seeking advantage or protection. Naomi Carter had asked for something entirely different. Adrian folded the paper carefully and returned it to his pocket before finally turning away from the window. Chicago will remember tonight as nothing special, he said calmly. No headlines. No rumors. Just another quiet evening. Marco crossed his arms and watched him closely. But we will remember. Adrian nodded once. Upstairs, Naomi Carter had finally stretched out on the bed in the guest room, exhaustion slowly pulling her toward sleep. The quiet house around her felt peaceful now, almost comforting. She had not intended to change anything when she wrote that note. She had only hoped someone might pause long enough to think about the people who would never be invited into powerful rooms. Yet somewhere downstairs in the same house, Adrian Romano stood alone in the kitchen where the night had changed direction, understanding that the most important decisions are sometimes shaped not by strategy or influence, but by the quiet courage of someone who believes a single voice can still matter. Morning arrived slowly over the Romano estate, sunlight stretching across the wide lawns and touching the tall windows of the mansion with a quiet golden glow. The long night had passed without headlines, without sirens, without the ripple of consequences that so often followed decisions made inside powerful rooms. Chicago woke the way it always did. Commuters filled the elevated trains, coffee shops opened their doors, and traffic lights blinked from red to green along busy avenues. Most people in the city would never know how close the night had come to unfolding differently. Inside the mansion, the house stirred gently as the staff began their morning routines. Naomi Carter woke a little later than usual in the guest room on the second floor. For a few seconds she lay still, staring at the ceiling while the memory of the previous evening returned piece by piece. The hallway outside was quiet except for the faint sound of dishes in the kitchen below. Naomi sat up slowly and walked toward the window. The view of the estate in daylight felt calmer than the tension she had sensed the night before. The wide lawns were peaceful, and a pair of gardeners moved quietly near the oak trees at the edge of the property. For a moment Naomi wondered if the entire experience had been some strange dream. Yet the folded note she had written was no longer in her apron pocket, and the memory of Adrian Romano kneeling beside her on the marble floor remained too vivid to dismiss. After getting dressed, she stepped into the hallway and walked downstairs, uncertain what the morning would bring. When she entered the kitchen, she found Adrian already there, standing beside the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. The early light from the windows outlined his tall figure against the polished marble surfaces that she had cleaned so many times before. For a brief moment Naomi hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether she should greet him the way she always had or pretend the previous night had never happened. Adrian noticed her immediately and offered a calm nod. "Good morning, Naomi." His voice sounded exactly the same as it had the night before, steady and composed, but there was something warmer in the tone that had not existed before. Naomi stepped further into the room. "Good morning, Adrian." Saying his name again still felt unusual, yet he did not correct her. Adrian set his coffee cup on the counter and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He unfolded the same sheet of paper she had written and placed it carefully on the marble island between them. The single sentence rested quietly under the morning light. Naomi looked down at the note, then back at him. "I did not mean to keep it," Adrian said. "But I think it belongs to you." Naomi picked up the paper slowly, her fingers brushing the familiar ink lines. "Thank you," she replied softly. Adrian studied her for a moment before speaking again. "There is something else," he said. Naomi waited, uncertain what he meant. Adrian gestured toward the window where the city stretched far beyond the estate gates. "Last night reminded me that influence should protect the people who never stand in rooms like mine," he said. "That perspective is rare." Naomi did not know how to respond, so she simply listened. Adrian continued. If you are willing, I would like you to stay here and help me remember that perspective. Naomi blinked in surprise. You mean, continue working here? Adrian gave a small nod. Yes. But not only as someone who cleans the house. Naomi's expression showed clear confusion. Adrian explained calmly. I spend most of my time hearing from advisors who understand strategy. I need someone nearby who understands people. Naomi looked down at the note again, still trying to process what he was saying. I am not an advisor, she said quietly. Adrian smiled faintly. You already advised me once. For a moment the kitchen remained silent except for the soft sounds of the morning outside. Naomi folded the note carefully and held it close to her chest. All I did was write what I believed, she said. Adrian met her eyes with quiet certainty. Sometimes belief is exactly what changes the world. The sunlight continued to brighten the room, reflecting softly across the marble floor where the night before a quiet voice had altered the course of an entire conflict. And in that peaceful kitchen, the most powerful man in Chicago stood across from the maid who had reminded him that dignity and courage could exist in the most unexpected places, leaving both of them to understand that real power is not measured by the battles someone wins, but by the moments they choose to protect what matters most.